On October 13th, 1947, a B-17 bomber took off from an airfield near Tampa, Florida, and flew directly into the eye of an active Atlantic hurricane more than 400 miles east of Jacksonville. The crew was not there to observe the storm. They were there to kill it. On board were canisters of crushed dry ice, approximately 80 pounds of frozen carbon dioxide, and the orders were simple. Fly into the hurricane, dump the ice into the clouds surrounding the eye wall, and see what happens. What happened next nearly ended the program before it began. Within hours of the seeding, the hurricane changed direction. It had been tracking northeast, harmlessly out to sea. After the ice was dropped, it turned west, slammed into the coast of Georgia, and struck the city of Savannah with devastating force. The public blamed the scientists. Lawsuits were threatened. Congress demanded answers. General Electric, the company whose researchers had designed the experiment, quietly withdrew from hurricane modification research and did not return for over a decade. The official position was that the storm's turn was coincidental, that a hurricane in 1906 had followed an identical path without any human intervention. That may have been true, but the damage was done, and the idea of controlling hurricanes became, overnight, the most dangerous scientific proposition in America. And yet, 15 years later, the United States government tried again, and this time they did not stop for 21 years. To understand why a rational government would attempt to control the most powerful weather system on Earth, you need to understand what hurricanes were doing to the United States in the 1950s. Between 1954 and 1960, the Atlantic hurricane seasons were catastrophic. Hurricane Hazel in 1954 killed over 1,000 people across the Caribbean and the eastern seaboard, flattening entire communities in the Carolinas. Hurricane Audrey in 1957 killed over 400 people in Louisiana alone, with a storm surge that swept inland for 20 miles. Hurricane Donna in 1960 struck Florida, then the Carolinas, then New England, becoming one of the only recorded storms to produce hurricane-force winds in 3 separate states during a single landfall sequence. The damage was measured in billions. The deaths were measured in thousands. And the forecasting technology of the era could provide, at best, 12 to 24 hours of warning. There were no weather satellites. Radar coverage was limited. Hurricane track prediction was closer to guesswork than science. Congress responded with funding for the National Hurricane Research Project, and among its mandates was a question that today sounds like science fiction, but in 1960 sounded like survival. Can we weaken a hurricane before it reaches land? The proposals that emerged from the research community range from the plausible to the insane. Cool the ocean's surface with icebergs towed from the Arctic. Absorb sunlight using carbon black dust scattered across the cloud tops. Use massive fans to blow the storm back out to sea. Detonate a nuclear weapon inside the eye. Each idea was studied, documented, and in most cases, quietly discarded. But one concept survived the scrutiny. Seed the clouds surrounding the eye wall with silver iodide, a chemical compound that mimics the crystalline structure of natural ice to trigger the freezing of supercooled water inside the storm. If that sounds straightforward, it is not. But the theory behind it was elegant. A hurricane's power is concentrated in its eye wall, the ring of towering thunderstorms that surrounds the calm center. The tighter the eye wall, the faster the winds. The faster the winds, the more destructive the storm. The hypothesis was that by seeding the clouds just outside the eye wall with silver iodide, you could cause supercooled water to freeze, releasing latent heat, which would invigorate convection and force a new, wider eye wall to form at a greater distance from the center. A wider eye wall means a larger circle. A larger circle means weaker winds because angular momentum is distributed over a greater radius. In theory, a successful seeding could reduce a hurricane's maximum sustained winds by 10 to 30%. Even a 10% reduction in wind speed translates to roughly a 30% reduction in destructive force. In 1962, the project was formally established. It was called Stormfury, and it was a joint venture of the United States Department of Commerce, the United States Navy, and the National Science Foundation. Its first director was Robert Simpson, one of the developers of the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale that is still used today. Its later director was Joanne Simpson, the first woman in American history to earn a doctorate in meteorology, a scientist who had built the first computer model of cloud behavior. They were not fringe researchers. They were the best atmospheric scientists in the country. Now here is where the story gets extraordinary, because for a brief moment, it appeared to work. On August 24th, 1963, aircraft flew into Hurricane Beulah and released silver iodide canisters directly into the eye wall. Within hours, the eye wall appeared to collapse. A new, wider eye wall formed at a greater radius. Maximum sustained winds dropped by approximately 20%. The results matched the hypothesis almost exactly. The scientists were cautious, but electrified. 6 years later, on August 18th and 20th, 1969, Hurricane Debbie was seeded on 2 separate days. On the first day, maximum winds decreased by roughly 31%. The storm re-intensified overnight. On the second seeding, winds dropped again by approximately 15%. The data was published, and the press covered it extensively. For a brief, heady moment in the late 1960s, the United States government believed it was learning to control hurricanes. If you are starting to sense that this story does not end well, you are paying attention. The problems began accumulating quietly. The strict safety criteria for seeding required that the target hurricane have less than a 10% chance of approaching inhabited land within 24 hours, that it be within range of the seeding aircraft, and that it have a well-formed eye. These restrictions made eligible storms extraordinarily rare. Across 21 years of operation, Stormfury was only able to attempt seeding on 4 hurricanes across a total of 7 days. The sample size was absurdly small for drawing scientific conclusions about anything, let alone the most complex atmospheric phenomenon on Earth. Then came the deeper problem. By the mid-1970s, researchers had discovered that the fundamental hypothesis was wrong. Hurricanes, it turned out, do not contain nearly as much supercooled water as the theory required. The clouds inside a hurricane are dominated by natural ice crystals, not liquid water waiting to be frozen. Silver iodide seeding could not trigger a process that the storm had already completed on its own. Worse, scientists studying unseeded hurricanes discovered that eye wall replacement cycles, the exact structural changes that Stormfury had attributed to seeding, occur naturally in strong hurricanes without any human intervention. The 20% wind reduction in Beulah, the 31% drop in Debbie. These results, which had seemed so promising, could not be distinguished from what the storms would have done anyway. The data did not prove that seeding worked. The data proved that hurricanes are variable, that they pulse and breathe and restructure themselves constantly, and that humans observing these changes after dropping chemicals into the storm had mistaken correlation for causation. There was also a political dimension that nearly destroyed the project years before the science did. In 1965, Stormfury meteorologists identified Hurricane Betsy as a candidate for seeding while it was far out at sea. Before any aircraft could reach it, Betsy turned sharply toward land and struck southern Florida with catastrophic force. The press, for reasons that remain unclear, reported that seeding had been conducted. It had not. Congress and the public blamed Stormfury for steering the hurricane into Florida. It took project officials 2 months to convince lawmakers that no seeding had occurred. Fidel Castro accused the United States of weaponizing hurricanes against Cuba, a claim that was scientifically baseless but politically potent across Latin America and the Caribbean. Several nations formally objected to any hurricane modification experiments conducted in the Atlantic Basin, arguing that weakening a storm in one location could redirect it toward their coastlines. The diplomatic fallout restricted the geographic range of Stormfury's operations to a narrow corridor of open ocean where no political objections could be raised, further reducing the already tiny pool of eligible storms. The last experimental seeding flight was conducted in 1971. For 12 more years, the project continued to exist on paper, publishing observational research, refining hurricane models, and gradually accepting that its central mission had failed. In 1983, Stormfury was officially canceled. But the failure was not total, not even close. The observational data, gathered during 21 years of flying directly into hurricanes, transformed the science of storm prediction. The aircraft instrumentation, developed for Stormfury, became the foundation of modern hurricane reconnaissance. The Lockheed P-3 Orion aircraft that carried Stormfury scientists into the eye wall are still flown today by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration as hurricane hunters, providing the real-time wind speed, pressure, and temperature measurements that feed the forecast models used to issue evacuation orders across the Gulf and Atlantic coasts. The storm life cycle research that emerged from the project's failure, the understanding of eye wall replacement cycles, of how hurricanes naturally strengthen and weaken, became the basis of intensity forecasting that has saved thousands of lives in the decades since. The project that failed to control hurricanes ended up teaching us how to predict them, and that knowledge, delivered in the form of a 48-hour forecast instead of a 12-hour guess, is the difference between an evacuated coastline and a mass grave. The Atlantic hurricane season still runs from June 1st through November 30th. The storms still form off the coast of West Africa, still feed on warm ocean water, still curve northward along the Gulf Stream, still slam into the same coastlines they have been striking for millennia. Still, no one has weakened a hurricane. No one has steered one. No one has found a way to drain the heat from a system that generates energy equivalent to a 10-megaton nuclear detonation every 20 minutes. The pilots who flew into those storms in the 1960s described breaking through the eye wall as a kind of violence that defied comparison, a roaring, hammering darkness followed by sudden silence and blinding light inside the eye. They dropped their canisters, recorded their instruments, and flew back out through the wall on the other side, believing that the data they gathered might someday give humanity a hand on the throttle of the most powerful engine in the atmosphere. It did not. But the instruments they carried, the readings they recorded, and the models they built from 21 years of looking a hurricane directly in the face are the reason you know right now, 3 days before a storm arrives, exactly where to run.